I think the key thing is focus on what your role is and look at it and say what things here are really repetitive that could easily be done by a machine. And go ahead and take advantage of the things like most companies now have some version of Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT and get ahead of it. You can automate some of those things and look at the part of your job that is really, you can't think of a way to automate it and really demonstrate that value.
Hello, and welcome to Pharma Sessions, a place for pharmaceutical leaders to come and learn from each other. I'm your host, Jonathan Kaskey. Technology and market trends are bringing change at an ever-accelerating rate, and no person, team, or company can afford to be left behind. Here, we dive into the strategies and tactics that our guests use to tackle these challenges and create new opportunities, and how you can do the same in your own organization. This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Xsunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform. On today's episode of Pharma Sessions, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Tim Smith, Head of Data Science Community and AI Innovation at Takeda. Tim's career sits right at the intersection of science and technology, starting as a chemist and toxicologist to becoming an early adopter of machine learning in pharma, long before the wave of AI hype that's we're currently in the middle of. He's helped build some of the first commercial AI applications in the industry, led large-scale collaborations with institutions like MIT, and now focuses on one of the hardest problems in pharma today, how to actually get people to adopt and trust AI at scale. What makes me particularly excited to talk to Tim is his perspective. It's really compelling about AI evolution from niche experimentation to enterprise priority, and now working on the human side of the equation, change management, trust, real world impact. So with that, we'll dive right in. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Thank you. All right, before we get started, I always like to do a little icebreaker. And my current one, I used to ask people, what have you had to eat so far today? Which I feel like you always learn a lot about people. But now my current one is, what is your go-to karaoke song?
Oh my gosh. It's more important to know which one I'll never do again.
Oh, gosh, now we have to know. What is that?
I'll Melt With You. It's a song that I thought it would be easy to do.
Yeah.
And it went on forever.
Yeah.
And it was like, I just couldn't do it. So I think if I like to do I Fought the Law.
I love
That's one of my favorite ones to do.
Clash is one of the greatest bands of all time. It's very, very good. Almost a little reggae inspired, that one too. So That's excellent. All right. So now we know a little bit about you, right? And tell me about your background. You started as a chemist and toxicologist. So how did you get from there to where you currently sit at AI and data science?
So the chemist piece, early on, I left as a bachelor's, moved to San Francisco from Seattle, and was working at the University of California, San Francisco, as a lab tech doing analytical chemistry. And I realized I didn't know nearly enough about the biology that I was supposedly doing the research on. So I thought I better go to grad school. And so toxicology seemed like the right mix of chemistry and biology. So I went and did a degree, a PhD there in Cornell in neurotoxicology. And while in the postdoc following that work, I was headhunted into a startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Lion Bioscience. It was an early bioinformatics company. And that's how I transitioned or went from wet lab to in silico research. It was exciting. It was a really little company. It grew and then it grew too big and then disappeared. It's like an arc of about 4.5 years, leaving me to pursue informatics in a large pharma. I started at Novartis. I pretty quickly they realized I like to do sort of large scale projects. So building like pipeline analytics, a database to track all of our projects across the company, things like that. And in that process, I realized that there's something new on the horizon called machine learning. I was watching these Kaggle competitions, and it was fascinating that the experts weren't doing as well as like predicting things like air traffic control, on time types of projects, things like that. And so I think this is something special. I got to take some time out.
Around what year is this that we're talking about?
2008.
Okay.
Or 9, right around there. It was just kind of getting on my radar. I know, of course, it wasn't new, and they have all the history and the AI winter, and it's been around for a long time. But this is when it kind of caught my eye, and we actually formed a little group at Novartis that we called us the Random Foresters, and we would meet and kind of talk about where we could apply this. And so that's kind of how it got started. And then in that process, we developed a few projects. One of the first, I think the first commercial application of AI/ML in Novartis with a company called Who Knows. And it was an interesting idea of using combination of analytics, natural language processing, and behavioral analytics to see what people are working on, what they're reading, and then getting to know who they are so they could connect with other folks that are similar. It was an early project. It didn't get additional funding.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes it's hard to show ROI right off the bat. And so, but then in that process, I guess I got the fever, and eventually I published a book.
Yeah, tell us about your book.
So the title was How to Profit and Protect Yourself from Artificial Intelligence.
Yeah. I feel like that should be the number one bestseller right now these days, because those are the two things that everybody is both excited about and also kind of scared about, if we're being honest. So what prompted you to take it to that level and to actually write a book about it?
I think it was that mixture of seeing how it's going to change pharma.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had gone down the street to a Friday afternoon seminar at MIT, and Eric Brynjolfsson was talking, and he was talking about how, this new information revolution and how it was going to change jobs. And so I started reading more and more in that space, mm-hmm. and came across this really interesting idea of bias and also the idea of whose jobs are really at risk. Mm. And so that was kind of the profit and protect yourself. Initially, this is before LLMs and things like that came along. So we're really looking at automation. They already had deep learning and things like that. So what's at risk? What can people do that machines can't do? And when will that change? So it was kind of exploring those concepts.
And what are some of the key themes that you were pulling out as far as what people should be doing in order to both, I guess we can take it one at a time. Let's start with avoiding the negative, right? In order to protect yourselves, what are some of the key themes that you're suggesting people should be considering?
In the book, we kind of explore initially a continuum of what are complicated things for machines to solve. Mm-hmm. And so it could be, at either end of the spectrum is usually high creativity and then high physical dexterity. Mm-hmm. And so things like hairdressers and construction workers, working with a varying environment, they're far more protected than you would have for someone who does something that's in a controlled environment, right, and is easily reproducible. So that was sort of the general theme. We kind of looked at different jobs there. And I think as we're seeing now, even accounting and other things that used to seem like no way a machine could do it, that's based, and we're seeing more and more AI taking over that. And at the other end of the spectrum, the highly creative, innovative thinking. Now I think we're going to see machine assisted in that space. But I think that what is novel, the idea was at that point, machine learning was really strong with lots of data. Mm-hmm. But the edge of knowledge, that sort of pointy edge, that doesn't have a lot of data around it because that's the unknown. That's where people are strong, are stronger.
Yeah. Now, what if you're in a role, like a lot of people that are listening to this are not in construction, are not in a creative artistic role. They might be in medical affairs. They might be in commercial operations, right? They might be doing sort of your standard office work at big pharma. What is your advice to them short of changing careers?
I think the key thing is focus on what your role is and look at it and say, what things here are really repetitive that could easily be done by a machine. Mm. And go ahead and take advantage of the things like most companies now have some version of Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT, and get ahead of it. You can automate some of those things and look at the part of your job that really you can't think of a way to automate it and really demonstrate that value. Right? I just saw like Meta's laying off a ton of people. It was in the news this morning. And there's some things I think we'll probably see some undulations where people will react and think, oh, AI is going to do all these things for us. But then there will be a retraction where certain things aren't working. I feel like, and I really relate with most people, that your role in a company can kind of feel stable. It's not in the long run. When I was at Novartis, there was a guy and he just celebrated his 40th anniversary with the company, which was remarkable. That was when I first started there. And now, that just seems impossible.
Right. It was actually, it was in the news. The guy who, I forget his name, who is taking over as CEO of Apple, his LinkedIn was very funny because it's like no picture and his two jobs were like an internship somewhere and then 26 years at Apple or something like that. Right. But I think what you're saying, the way I think about this is operating at the top of your pay grade. And I'll give an example. So if you are in sales at a pharma company, if you're a rep in the field, your job is to go out and have conversations with prescribers and ultimately drive prescriptions of your product within your territory. Your job isn't really but there's a lot of stuff you need to do in order to be good at that. That's not the point of your job, right? Like the point of your job is not to have know your sales data and the marketing data and the responsiveness data to all your field triggered emails or something like that, like the back of your hand. But it's really helpful to do that. So I think of AI as, okay, well, what is the point of all of this is to do X. What's all the other stuff that I need to understand and I need to do in order to do X? And the more that you can offload some of that work, look at this data and summarize what I should be taking from all of that. At least a first pass, and you can go back and you can pressure test it. You're putting time back in your day, and maybe that's how you go from seeing 2.5 doctors a day to 3.5 doctors a day. That's how you're increasing your value to the company. And I think there's a million examples like that. But to me, it all comes down to understanding really what is the point of your job and then you're almost delegating some of the stuff that you need to do in order to be successful. It used to be to other teams. Now maybe it's more to AI or it's a combination, but that's basically how I'm thinking about it. And I'm just curious your reaction to that.
That's a great example. I think the two things I might mention. One thing that was brought up in the book I wrote was in the legal profession, certain things that are extremely automatable now. When you get, say, 1 million documents and you're doing corporate litigation, you used to have an army of people reading through that, looking for a sentence or a term or a concept that you are using to build your case. Now we can do that in seconds. And so those jobs are definitely going away. But it's the question, like, what am I actually looking for, which is the really high value thing now. And it kind of goes to what you're saying, like, what are you really there for? And so they kind of went also then to case law. Certain things are boilerplate. And so they're really automatable, but being on the edge of deciding, how to steer policy with changes in the law, these are human litigatable levels. And then also back then to pharma, one thing I really encourage people to do is we're all sitting in a lot of data. No matter what you do, your stack of emails is data. You're in a lab, your instrument data, like it's all there. And now with these great tools like Claude Code, you can really go in and start asking questions that you couldn't do before. You'd have to have a friend who really knew how to code, who understood data science. You can really get a messy first run. And so being creative isn't always just about, the person that knows how to write well or a person who knows how to compose a nice sonnet or something like that. Creative is, what am I looking at? What is this? Could this tell me? Where your world will change if you find something interesting. And people are more interested in following up too. When you have data and a way to categorize it or summarize it or make predictions with it, that's all the great stuff I can do. And now it's closer to your finger than you can imagine.
If you've been enjoying the conversations here on Pharma Sessions, you should know they're made possible by the team at Exunt. Exunt helps life sciences companies turn complex data into clear, actionable insight. For years, Exunt has made complicated data sets simple to help commercial, medical, and operations teams map what's happening, predict what's next, and make stronger decisions faster. And now there's an added AI layer that makes everything work so much better. I was actually pretty jaded about some of the AI approaches I'd seen, but when Exunt showed me theirs, I actually left my job to come work for them. It's really awesome. So if you want to understand your market, your customers, or your performance with more clarity than ever, check out exunt.com. That's XSUNT.com. All right, let's jump back into the episode. So this is all very kind of relevant to the stuff that I see in the day-to-day, because just full disclosure, we have a data company and people are querying data with AI. But what's also interesting is you're sort of limited by your imagination now, right? Like it can tell you the things, but then if you're like, hey, add this to my dashboard, create a dashboard, it can actually do the work for you too. And those are things that used to be, you had to go log a ticket in Jira or something, and then your team would get back to you like a week later and you'd have it. And I see this all the time. Like our engineers are always saying, bring us your ideas, right? And we'll spin up a mock-up and we'll have it to you this afternoon. Like it's not going to be functional. It's not going to be operable at scale, but you could at least play around with it and see if it's working the way you want. That was a bit of the avoiding the negative. Let's shift to the positive part, and maybe then we can transition back into how do you then take that positive and actually implement it at pharma, because I really want to get to that. But the title of your book is, so it's basically protect yourself and profit. So how, if you're in these roles, where does the profit part come in?
So I think that's by talking about like the protect yourself piece, in terms of use these new tools, don't wait, have someone else figure out how to use them, and then your role becomes redundant.
Yeah.
The profit part of that is also look at what you're doing and the problems you're trying to solve, and think about ways that AI can do that for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of the same thing, but there's a number of different examples that we look at. Then some of them are more not related to your day-to-day life in the sense of like, explored how deep learning, et cetera, is helping autonomous vehicles work and things like that. There's all around you, there's AI now, in your phone and your car and everything else. But one example was kind of funny. When I first came to Takeda, it was like the first day of COVID lockdown. And one of the things we were trying to do was understand, how is this going to impact the company? And I'd only been there for like a week.
Wow.
And we had a ton of different types of data that we were looking at, but nobody was looking at the demographics, in terms of the age. They were all looking about how often or how many people might be infected.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always knew that the CIA has a ton of free data. If you go to their website, it's a treasure trove.
CIA as in the Central Intelligence Agency?
Yes.
Interesting.
And so,
okay.
Yeah. So I went there and they had all the demographic data for the world by country. And we also then had some internal data about the ages of people being infected.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really clear once you started mixing by country infection and by demographics that like countries, Lesotho, which is like 50% under the age of 18, they almost had no infections. And then older countries had many more. And so it definitely was at least a reportable disease at older levels. So that would be who we would want to look at first, and so it was just this idea that,
and this is happening sort of in real time, right? You're
in real time,
and you're coming up with a really key question, which is, I guess even at the early stages, it sounds like we knew that it didn't impact everybody the same, that infection rates were different and outcomes were different. And then you were using a massive data, world population data, to understand which countries were most at risk. And so how long did it take you with your AI background, with your machine learning background? How long did it take you all to sort of parse that and come to conclusions?
The initial one it just took like about a week.
Mm-hmm.
And working with, because I had a really talented team of data scientists. And so I was, kind of bringing things to the table again, like that first baked version. And then they were, since I'm kind of a hybrid of data science, AI, and chemistry, I'm kind of partial master of some things. That's again, like figuring out the problem. And then the creative part was, well, where else can we get data? It's not just like, well, here's our data set. What can we learn from it? And joining things is part of that creativity that you don't have to be, like I said, like a Rembrandt or a Picasso. You would have to just look around you and, notice there are things like, I'm always curious and played around with for years, the Sunshine Act data, which companies are paying which researchers and kind of building trends and stuff like that from that data, knowing it's only a slice of the world, but it has a lot to tell you. And so you can then again join that with other types of data to come up with different insights.
It's interesting you use the word curious, because as you were talking, I was thinking curiosity seems to be a really important attribute to have these days. And a big part of your role is around institutional change and enterprise change and adoption of this. So what are you seeing around change management? What are the bottlenecks that you're trying to avoid? And how are you managing kind of bringing this to, again, a massive organization? Takeda is a huge company at scale.
Yeah, I think I've seen is some of the more kind of obvious things they're adopted quickly because they're so easy to use. We saw from ChatGPT coming out in, was it November of 2022? And by January, it had millions of users.
Right.
It's because it was so easy. You went in, you typed some stuff, and it was pretty fantastic what you got back. Even if it was wrong, it's like...
It was wrong, but it was fun.
But yeah, exactly. But what I found with like enterprise applications, like I think that you have the strong side of Microsoft, which most companies have that as their kind of backbone for Excel and Word and document management, all those sort of things. That is pretty natural. Like people can use that, and it works in that space, and that's Microsoft's strong suit. The other side of it is the research and development piece, where you really are building unique applications for unique problems that are pharma specific. And these are the ones that are more challenging. And it's funny, what you're really trying to do is help the team that understands the problem really tell you what's the value. Not for their team, they intuitively know it. But then sometimes it takes even a few iterations over several weeks to get a narrative that management understands, and then they'll fund going from your proof of concept to a production level product. And for me, that's one of the bigger challenges. And when it does work, then it goes, because then everyone gets it. But sometimes it can be so, you get it viscerally, because that's why you've been doing this. But being able to translate it into something that anyone understands in 5 minutes, that's kind of the next step.
Well, and then there's also, even once they understand it, what I've seen, and I don't know if this is improving or not, but there are real, sometimes operational challenges, even once everybody's agreed that this makes sense. And a lot of it is, we keep referring to data as if it's this one cohesive thing, but a lot of times it is not even close to normalized. And it's like, even if you think about on the commercial side, right, your prescription data is coming from IQVIA, from Symphony. Your activity data might be coming from Viva or Salesforce. Then there's the pharmacy data. There's formulary data. Some of these might refer to patients as patients. Some of them might say be PTS period. There's all sorts of weird stuff that happens when you're combining data from different sources. Or like in other projects that I run, we're trying to, I used to do a lot of work in the documentation space. And the challenge with big companies is that they've acquired 1 million small companies, and all of them have like slightly different formats and different templates and everything. And you're talking about like millions of documents. What's the chicken and the egg, right? When do you start looking at creating an underlying foundation that's going to allow you to apply any type of AI or machine learning to it, or really probably AI at this point, versus you're creating the business case and then saying, all right, and now we need to go figure out how we're going to actually give ourselves a resource that we can point this thing at.
No, I think that's a great point and a challenge. Over the years, have seen platforms come and go, especially they're sometimes easier to build and fund because they have that almost 5-minute elevator pitch built in. It's sort of like, let's build a data lake and it'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. And then several years later and millions of dollars, it's sort of like, oh, we didn't really do the right metadata. And so it's got everything in there, but we can't really find it. And so that's,
that is 100% accurate, right? That is very true. I'm sure that's a true story.
It's not a criticism per se, but it's sort of like when you build up from a small problem, you kind of grow. But when you have like a big solution and then hope it finds problems, it can be a challenge. But I think one of the things that I think is a really good idea is really understanding where your data is and what it is. And that's kind of a challenge. It's not impossible. Financial data generally is financial data, but it probably has a few hooks in it that connect it to your pipeline, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And your pipeline then should have what targets you're working on. And so there are threads through all of this that can make them connectable and might not always be the fastest or best thing is to build a big platform and then, after several years, turn on the questions. I'm okay with a little bit messy.
Yep.
Where, some of the things are working really smooth, other ones are going to take some work. One of these problems we had was trying to build a system where you can model data and you can borrow data from other labs. It's similar. And that was a cool idea. But I think one of the problems was even slight differences in the data made it a little trickier to make the comparisons that you thought you might make.
Yep.
But the best part was that you could actually see the other labs' data. So say a bunch of people were doing flow cytometry, you could see these guys are doing that, and this other lab's doing it, but their analytics might be very different. And that's where the conversation was actually helpful. The tool didn't do it. It was kind of not a success, but that conversation was a success. Yeah. And, so kind of pointed to, well, should we all use the same, vendor, or should we all build something internally that does exactly what we want? These are, I think, important ways for people to connect. And that kind of goes back to how you profit. I think people are still the key to how all this works right now, because someone has to make sense of it and then propagate it is crucial. Someone might say, well, there'll be some super smart agent one day, it'll just make all these decisions on its own. And I don't know, maybe.
Right. Let's close with just a little bit of forward looking. But if you were going, let's say you get pulled into a room and you've got, all the pharma CEOs in the world. They're all listening to you. They're all hanging on your every word. What's one mindset shift that you would suggest they take to really position themselves and their companies up for success going forward in this world of AI?
I think that particularly in pharma, and again, I have the R&D hat, that's kind of where I come from, is our taking advantage of generative AI for really everything from target selection up through the clinic. The more integrated that knowledge set is, the faster and better you're going to work. And the caveat to that is a friend of mine who's CEO of a company that does a lot of automated compound discovery, even he said, you really, really depend on the medicinal chemist still. He said, I thought I could automate them out of the process. And so really understanding where you have and need expertise and cultivate that expertise, pay for it, because you can generate a ton more molecules now in a shorter amount of time. But having some people that can comment on, are you on the right track?
Yep.
Is hyper valuable. And that's where I'm still very people centric. And I think that's where also you want to develop your people that are facile. They want to work with the assistants, but they have an opinion and they have over time an expertise that helps them be critical.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Because at the end of the day, pharma is its own unique beast. Like if you were trying to, let's say you were at a creative agency and you're making an advertisement and you use AI and say, okay, well, this gets us 80% of the way there and it's faster and it's cheaper. That might be okay. But if you're creating a drug that's about to have to go through a 10-year clinical trial at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, it's probably not good enough, right? So the idea is like get there faster, but you still do ultimately need something that is really held to a different quality standard than a lot of other industries for good reason, right? We all depend on these, or we will at some point in our lives. So, okay, Tim, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun. I will publish the link to your book when we post the podcast episode. So anybody who's made it at this point, thank you. And check out the show notes and read Tim's book. I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This is a pleasure.
All right, great. Excellent. This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Exunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Pharma Sessions with me, Jonathan Kaskey. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe and share it with someone else in the pharma world who might need to hear it. For more on pharma trends, career growth, and business strategies, connect with me, Jonathan Kaskey, on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks for listening.